Hello, my name is Vicki Brenner. I'm a library technician with Oxford County Library. I'd like to welcome you to Oxford Local History Day for 2022. We're celebrating the history of Oxford County with many presentations today, and we're very fortunate to have my co-presenter today, George Emery. He has a forthcoming book that details Black history in the town of Ingersoll. So he's going to relate some of the content of the book and share with you his insight into this period of our history. So I'll turn it over now to George Emery.
Thanks, Vicki. It's a pleasure being here for Local History Day because here in the library, I'm in the nerve center of resources to do local history. Vicki and her team have produced an amazing archive for local history. Some of the things in hard copy, a ton of it is digital. You can access it from the comfort of your own home. And we work closely with the Ingersoll Cheese Museum and other centers nearby. The Beachfield Museum sometimes gets involved with us. So it's an honor to be here in the nerve center of local history. It's also a pleasure to return to my hometown. I went to public school and high school here in the 40s and 50s. And I remember in the 50s, somebody pointing out an old former church building on Oxford Street, which they said Black people used to worship in. And it was about to be torn down. And wasn't it a shame that our treasured artifacts seemed to get torn down? I learned later that what was known about that church building was wrong, and it didn't have much to do with Black history. That's part of what makes local history interesting. You can take things that were widely believed and revise them in light of advantages we have, not the least of which is the internet and the work of genealogists. It allows us to come up with new answers for old problems. Now, if we could go to the slide.
So we'll just share a screen and George will talk about his forthcoming book.
What you see is, I think, the only picture we have of Ingersoll in the late 1850s, when the story of Ingersoll Blacks really begins. This picture is taken from the south shore of the Thames River. You're looking north across the river. You can see the bridge has wooden sides, and the Great Western Railway freight sheds are on the left, along with the Great Western House, the hotel. So there's a shot from the 1850s. And the next slide. Is a person from these times that we're able to find a few things about. That's by far the best picture and close to the only really good picture we have of Blacks from the times we're talking about. And finding out about her experience points to quite a hard life. Born in the United States in 1833, came to Ingersoll in 1862, married Benjamin Wright about 1864, had 3 sons, William, Isaiah, and Ben Jr. And then it sort of falls apart. 1881, the husband abandons the home 1886, the youngest son at age 13 was angry at his mother for thrashing him, so he said, "She will never thrash me again in this house." And to ensure that that was so, he burnt down the family home. And they shipped him off to the Kingston Penitentiary for 5 years, and that's the last we've heard of him. The middle son, Isaiah, had problems with alcoholism, and in 1905, they found his body in the Thames River below the Wanham Street Bridge, where he apparently had been having a party with a bunch of mates on the bridge. And it was assumed someone pushed him for a while. There was a murder trial, but they assumed no, it was death by misadventure. There were a bunch of people drinking. Isaiah fell off. No one noticed that he had fallen off, and that was that story. And then we go to the end of Aunt Hattie's story with the next slide. Her obituary in 1913. The town council's looking after her a bit with food and fuel. But in February 1913, they went to her home. They got inside. They found her on the edge of death with her hands and feet frozen. And it was a sad end to a tough life. Now on to the book proper with the next slide. First of all, the Black population we're talking about. If you look at the graph on the top bar has the census populations for Ingersoll Village, and which became Ingersoll Town. And the second bar is the Black population, which is about 150 in 1861. Hangs up pretty well through the 1860s and 70s, and then dwindles away. It had been 6% of the village population in 1861. It's less than 1% by 1921. And what it adds up to is Ingersoll was a predominantly white race place with a small black race minority. And the basic questions are, what attracted blacks to Ingersoll during the early years? And what happened to them? What later directed them elsewhere? And one of the early stories is all about slavery. So just to implant some chronology in your mind, before the American Civil War, which is in the early 1860s, the United States had free states in the North and slave states in the South. So it had slavery. And slavery lasts formally until 1863, when the Union Army is on the verge of victory and it declares emancipation of the slaves. So there's pre-emancipation and post-emancipation, pre-Civil War, post-Civil War. Okay, next slide. I can't see the top there. Is there a way?
It won't be.
Yeah, what the book does. A general thing is the book aims to offer a history based on documentary evidence. The earlier interpretations of Ingersoll history don't have that quality for the most part. So how much does the early stuff help us? How much of it stands up when we insist that we have documentary evidence for the conclusions we make? Starting point is a caution that all of our documentary sources have a racial bias in favor of white supremacy. Even the census does. The census officials decided that there would be 4 races distinguished by skin color: white, black, red, and yellow. And the boundaries between them were arbitrary. White was anyone of pure white blood. Black was anyone with black blood in them. What the book does, it will give census profiles of the black population, where they were born, age, sex distributions, illiteracy, school attendance, type of housing they had, and where appropriate, it will compare them with whites in town. It doesn't tell you much if you just look at blacks in isolation. You have to have a basis for comparison. The black illiteracy rate, for example, was much higher than the white illiteracy rate. You only learn that if you study blacks and whites. The book takes a look at local historians who I regard as creators of Ingersoll's historical memory. When I was living in Ingersoll in the 1850s, there was an historical memory of Ingersoll in past times. It doesn't stand up very well, but we had an historical memory. So let's look at the local historians. One of them, James Sinclair, lived in Ingersoll through the early days. So he could claim to be a witness as well as a writer-up of that part of the historical memory. The people in the 1950s hadn't lived there, and they produce a different kind of historical memory. Then we take a look at historical memory. Is it evidence-based, or is it what our friend Donald Trump would call fake news? The book looks at aspects of Black culture, religion, Black speak as it appeared in white ears, how they felt about racial segregation. More generally, how did blacks and whites get along? Is it a history of violence or benevolent whites giving blacks a safe haven? Okay, the historical memory of the 1950s, when I lived here, was a great majority of blacks in Ingersoll before the Civil War were runaway slaves. Ingersoll blacks returned to the old slave states of the American South after emancipation, supposedly because biologically they didn't thrive in cold weather. I wonder about the snowbirds of our time. Ingersoll was the terminus of a white-assisted underground railway that spirited runaways from southern slave states to northern free states or to the sanctuary of Canada. The American 1850 Fugitive Slave Act created bounties for slave catchers, and these people came into Canada and tried to look for runaways and return them to the American South. Abolitionist whites in Ingersoll looked after the blacks, and the blacks were so grateful they donated free labor to build a white abolitionist Wesleyan Methodist church. That's the church that was pointed out to me on Oxford Street when I was a kid in the 50s. The Wesleyan Methodist Church was supposedly a clearinghouse for slaves, hiding them from slave catchers, directing them to jobs on nearby farms. Ingersoll abolitionist whites actively welcomed these refugees, giving them a safe haven. Ingersoll whites opposed slavery, and you could easily infer they accepted blacks as equals. And another part of the myth, the famous American abolitionist, white abolitionist, John Brown, who captured Harper's Ferry, armament center in Virginia, and hoped to lead a revolution against slavery, allegedly visited Ingersoll on April 15th, 1858, and tried to get recruits for John Brown's army to liberate the American South. John Brown can be remembered by the song, John Brown's body lies a molding in the grave. Or if, like me, you went to Queens college colors we are wearing once again. So John Brown lives on. Next slide, please. What we find with evidence is most blacks before the Civil War in Ingersoll had been free blacks, not runaway slaves, before they came to Ingersoll. In fact, there were no runaway slaves in Ingersoll or in all of Ontario because slavery was not allowed by British law as of 1793. A black might be free, might be a runaway in Michigan, but when he passed into Canada, he became an immigrant. The white Wesleyan Methodist Church in Ingersoll was not a clearinghouse for fugitives because the village didn't have any fugitives. The American Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 empowered slave catchers to pursue slave state fugitives in northern free states, but American laws don't apply to Canada. Ingersoll didn't have any slave catchers lurking about to snatch local blacks in defiance of British law. Ingersoll was not a terminus of the Underground Railway. The terminus was the Canadian border. Next slide, please. John Brown. In Ingersoll on April 15, 1858, to raise a private army. It's funny that the Ingersoll Chronicle didn't have any mention of it. It was against Britain's Foreign Enlistment Act of 1819. Would the Reeve and councillors of Ingersoll been happy with an American Yahoo speaking in the town hall to raise an army to attack the United States? Not very likely. The main answer in the book is blacks came to Ingersoll for jobs, not to flee oppression. Jobs were abundant when Ingersoll boomed, and there weren't as many jobs when the boom ended. By the 1880s, blacks were leaving small towns everywhere for jobs which were increasingly in rising cities. They weren't going back down to the southern states like modern snowbirds. Ingersoll whites opposed slavery, but they assumed white supremacy. Blacks and whites had conflicts. Interpretations that Ingersoll whites offered blacks a safe haven is kind of misleading. And then that brings us to the centerpiece of the book for whites making fun of blacks, the Darktown Fire Brigade. It's a set-piece minstrel show imported from the States, depicting Negro firemen as comically incompetent buffoons. Ingersoll brought in 4 Darktown performances, 1890, 1897, 1899, 1910. And on each occasion, a major civic holiday. Okay, there's the Ingersoll Darktown Firemen's Brigade celebration on King Street in 1910. And I'm going to close with that. This is some of the stuff the book does. I'm looking forward to it coming out. And I thank Vicki again for having me here to promote local history from my hometown.
Thank you, George, for your insight on Black history in Ingersoll and treating it with an evidence-based approach, which is something that is welcome, and documenting some of the myths as George related from the 1950s. So we look forward to reading your forthcoming book, and thanks again for participating in our event.